where the coffee is grown and how much it is. Who grows the most coffee? Stop there. Brazil. Brazil is the largest producer of coffee. Actually, by far, number one is Brazil. And then I just want you to note here, it says that Brazil has been in first place for over 150 years. I had to do a little bit of math on this to go back 150 years. It's hard to subtract in your head 2024 minus 150 goes back to, but I came up with 1874. 1870s or longer. Just want to put that in your head for a little bit. 1870s, 150 years ago, and what was going on in Brazil and other parts of the world at that time. Second, this was actually a big surprise to me. I hadn't thought. Second, anybody know what the second biggest is? No.
Vietnam.
Vietnam. Yeah, no, this kind of shocked me. Second place is Vietnam, introduced by French colonialists. And that's a lot of coffee for a pretty small place. And it's not as big as Brazil. And then, yes, Colombia is actually number three. Now, again, I want to talk about a couple things here. One is coffee's very cozy relationship with colonialism. In the case of Brazil, the Portuguese, case of Vietnam, the French, Colombia, of course, the Spanish, although their industry was more homegrown. We could also talk about Indonesia and Dutch colonialism there. So in most cases, there's a very tight link between a European colonizer and coffee production, and of course, the fact that most of the world's per capita coffee is consumed in the European countries. So there's this tight and long-standing relationship with colonialism, which has been true for a very long time and continues to this day. Now, like I said, most people in the United States, most of us are getting our coffee from Dunkin' Donuts. And most of that coffee comes from Brazil. And so Brazil is the big supplier of this. This was an article in the Washington Post a little bit ago, which talked about the conditions of workers on these coffee plantations. And they are more like plantations. And it talked about them as pretty darn close to being enslaved. So the coffee haters are actually correct. In terms of the supply of coffee, it's not so great. Now, I want to talk about this a little bit in terms of what happened in what is called the transatlantic slave trade or the enslavement of Africans. Now, when we think about plantations and enslavement and slavery in the United States, what do we usually think about? What crop comes to mind? Yeah, cotton. Yeah, we usually think about cotton. And cotton is huge, it's important, it's real. But if you look at the number of people who were taken from Africa into what became the United States, it's actually a very small percentage of the overall. It's something like 5%, maybe. It's not a big player. There are several tiny Caribbean islands, Jamaica, Hispaniola, that imported or brought more people from Africa than the entire United States. And the big player in this is Brazil and the Portuguese, which accounted for something like 40% of the entire enslavement. So when you think about who went where and why, the real players were not cotton in the United States, but why? What did they? What were they taken to Brazil for? Oh, so close. We would think it was coffee, but yeah. No, tobacco. Sugar. Sugar is the reason people were, that was the big plantation crop. More people were moved to cultivate sugar perhaps than any other crop ever in the world. In this case, dragged from their homeland, but in other cases, dragged from other places to cultivate sugar. The interesting thing here is coffee comes to us from this area of the world, and tea comes to us probably from this area of the world, and cacao, or what would later become chocolate, comes to us from this area of the world. And in all of those places, coffee, cacao, tea, those beverages, or what people made it into, were just drank as is. It's the Europeans who decided these things would be really great if we just load them full of sugar too. And so if you've ever been to the UK and see how much sugar the Brits are consuming with the tea or the coffee and the sugar or the chocolate, which they later figured out how to put sugar into, and that is what accounts for most of the enslavement patterns, as people were taken to these plantations to cut sugar cane. Now there's, like I said, there were several places in the Caribbean which imported more enslaved, dragged more enslaved Africans even than the entire, what would become the United States. And so there was this incredibly lucrative part of an island called Saint-Domingue, which was under French colonial rule, which for a while was producing more sugar, coffee, indigo, and cotton than almost anywhere else. An incredibly wealthy place. We're not producing that much sugar or coffee today. Why? Where's Saint-Domingue? Yes, it is Haiti. This is one of perhaps the only successful revolution in which the enslaved and people of color threw off colonial rule and became an independent country. And for that, they paid bitterly. Actually, it's the second independent country in the Americas after the United States. Second independent country. But they were basically shut out of the international system, and today is seen not as a wealthy place, but as a place of extreme hardship and poverty. But in fact, at the time, they were a major player in this game. So, as some of you noted, coffee is domesticated in this part of the world, spreads here, spreads there, or is spread by colonialism to these places. What I want to point out here is that every time we're drinking a coffee or a related energy drink beverage, we are drinking a truly global commodity. And it's a commodity that has been global for 400 or 500 years. All of these things happened, all these dates, before there was anybody studying anthropology or doing anything called anthropological studies. These plantations and various ways of growing and selling and sugaring coffee were already very fired up. So if we look back 150 years ago, I wanted you to keep this in mind, to the 1870s, we already have Brazil as the #1 coffee producer in the world, which it has been, as they said, for at least 150 years. And what's also crazy about that is that Brazil was one of the very last places to end slavery in 1888. So when our coffee producer people say, oh, Brazil has enjoyed this #1 position, yeah, because it was produced by enslaved Africans and their descendants as late as the 1870s and into the 1880s. Now, one of the reasons I'm so fixated on this time is that, as we will read in our next chapter, in chapter 2, the 1870s is also the time when we have the first definition of culture from E.B. Tylor, which we'll read soon enough. And so what I'd like to impress upon you is I tried to figure out if E.B. Tylor was actually a coffee drinker. I know he was at Oxford, I'm not sure, but a lot of people were coffee drinkers at the time. And so you have these anthropologists participating in this global economy and thinking about and coming up with words for people like primitive culture. That's where this comes from, volume 1 in the 1870s. Now, I don't know if Tylor was thinking about Brazil, but his first book was actually on Mexico, so he had been into the coffee belt. He had been to places where this could have been produced. And so what's interesting to me is that anthropology gets its start by thinking about so-called tribes and other groups in the Amazon and Brazil and in the Americas, but at a time when people had already been moved around and put into this global world system before anthropology would ever get going. So, as we think about chapter 2, culture, just think about what the world was like in the 1870s and how these early anthropologists were introducing this idea of culture into the world. What was it being put into or against, or what was anthropology trying to do with this new word? Well, it wasn't a new word, this new definition for an older word, culture. So that will be our next thing, is to read about culture